Good afternoon, dear colleagues, and welcome to our second lecture in our course called Different Quantitative Research Methods. Last time we were talking about the general research paradigms and the general approaches that we can take when we just start contemplating our research. Today we will think about more preparatory steps that we need to take before we actually start conducting our research. More specifically, we will take a look first at the decisions that we need to make as we plan our research, which will kind of plan out our whole course for the remainder of our time this semester. We'll also focus on ways to do a good literature review on different problems we encounter and face when we perform literature reviews. And also, we'll spend quite some time looking at research ethics, because ethical considerations are extremely important. It might be impossible to publish a piece of research unless the researcher was aware of these ethical considerations, and unless the researcher took the specific steps to implement the standard research ethics procedures in his or her research project. But first, let's take a moment to think, what does a research begin with? Basically, any research, my answer would be that any research begins with a research question. Any research happens because someone is interested in understanding something. And this question may even seem weird. Especially in psychology, our questions concern all kinds of mental phenomena, all kinds of mental processes, and sometimes these questions are very strange. And when we have your research question, for example, why do people feel a certain emotion in certain situations? You start by doing a literature review. You start by looking at existing theories, at existing findings that you could potentially refer to explain the phenomenon you're interested in. Of course, existing models may not be available out there, and then you need some way to express your research question in terms of existing scientific concepts, or maybe introduce a new concept in such a way as to make it clear and understandable for other members of our research community. After the literature review, we engage in formulating more specific hypotheses. Often, a general research question is not enough to inform our research, and we need to make it a bit more specific by splitting it into specific hypotheses that we can relate to particular variables or particular data collection procedures and so on. And this is where you start engaging into a phase which we call operationalizing. Basically, you start answering the questions. What exactly are you going to measure? How are you going to measure or study it? Where, in what conditions? What kind of individuals will you use as your sample? And all of these questions basically concern the choices of research methods that we need to make as researchers, and we will be discussing these whole choices for the remainder of our course. Then you collect your data, you analyze your data, and maybe you do it several times. And after, at some point, you start thinking, am I satisfied with the outcomes of my research? Does it actually answer my research question? And if your interest is not satisfied, you might actually do another cycle of research and do it until the very end of your research career. Some people actually research the same problem for the whole duration of their life, or maybe you just want to publish and move on and forget about this master's dissertation. So it all depends on your choice as a researcher. Now, the phenomena that can potentially inform our research question are absolutely ubiquitous. They are present everywhere. If you have been already to the center of Moscow, and if you have visited the metro station called Площадь Революции, the Revolution Square, you may have seen this statue of a dog with a nose that always is shining. And maybe you have seen some people who perform a strange act of behavior. They approach this dog, they rub the nose, and then they proceed and move on. And if you're very observant and familiar with this station, maybe you've seen that there are actually 4 dogs, and all of them have shiny noses. Now the question I would like to ask is, what research questions can you think of in respect to this strange behavior that people exhibit? What kind of questions can you ask? And you can pause the video for a second and just formulate a few questions for you. So if you've done this little exercise, obviously the number of these questions is absolutely immense, but the questions that come up to my mind, how do different people react to the statue? For example, what percentage of people do rub and don't rub the nose? Or how do people perceive this situation? What kind of meaning do they ascribe to this particular behavioral act, which is obviously extremely irrational behavior? Why do different people behave in different ways? And these are questions about individual differences. What kind of situational factors may actually facilitate or influence this behavior? Maybe it's the season or the time of the year, or maybe it's the time when exams happen at universities that people start rubbing the nose, or which personality dispositions influence this behavior. Perhaps it could be anxiety, or it could be some kind of cognitive patterns, maybe tendency towards magical thinking. Or basically the question, why? Why do people perform this action? What motivates them? What kind of motives actually compel it? So the number of these questions is absolutely huge. And the question is, how do we actually find out whether each of these questions is a scientific problem or not? Well, it depends on several things. First of all, a scientific problem is formulated using scientific concepts, and it refers to a scientific view of reality. When we formulate our research question, we need to formulate it in terms of notions of scientific psychology, in terms of concepts that are familiar to reviewers, that are common to our research community, because if not, the reviewers might treat our work as a nonsense. It will make no sense to them. The second consideration, I think, is whether this research problem is related to existing theories, whether it seems relevant within current scientific discourse. Some research problems are extremely interesting, but they were kind of in fashion in the 19th century, and nowadays people don't really care about them anymore. Or maybe these problems have already been resolved, or the community thinks that we have already sufficient data and sufficient theorizing to explain this thing, and there is no need to engage in this anymore. Of course, you might actually turn the whole field back or start a paradigm shift by focusing on a completely new problem. But it's a bit hard always to go against the common trend. And finally, whether this question is important for society. Would anyone be actually willing to give you money to fund this research? Or within the context of a university, how about the professors at your department? Are you going to find a supervisor to help you study this topic? Or maybe there is no one who is interested in it, and then we have to say, okay, maybe I will study something else. But overall, right now, you're in an extremely privileged position. You're extremely lucky because in principle, you can research whatever you want. Then when you go to your doctoral school, you're probably going to research what your professor wants. And then when you start your tenure track, you're typically tend to research what your tenure committee wants or what your university wants. When you're a tenured professor, you're researching whatever your grant committee wants. And it's only when you retire that you can, again, have the privilege of researching whatever absolutely you're interested in. Of course, this is a bit in extreme to make it funny, but in principle, it has some truth to it. One important issue about the choice of a research question is that our research question can lead us towards more quantitative approach or towards more qualitative approach. Quantitative questions typically are about some causal links between variables x and y. For example, is extroversion associated with rubbing a dog's nose? And this is a clear quantitative question. You can give people questionnaires, and then you can see whether they rub the dog's nose, and then you can calculate the correlation. Because in order to answer this question, you need to generalize. You need some statistical procedures. Or another way to formulate the same question, do people with individual differences exhibit different behaviors? And this is also a question about association. Basically, do extroverts rub the dog's nose more often than do introverts? In principle, this is pretty much the same. Another type of questions relate to qualitative studies, and these are typically the questions about people's experience. They usually start with the words how or why. How do you experience this situation? Or why did you perform this behavior? And here you would be more likely to do some interview study or some open-ended questionnaire in order to get many different answers and to generalize over them to formulate more specific questions. And of course, your study can have different aims. Your study can be exploratory. You might not be quite sure what it is that you're exactly looking for. You might just be looking for interesting associations between variables, or you might be interested in describing phenomena in order to arrive at more specific hypotheses and in order to conduct a more planned, more structured study. Very often, exploratory studies can be qualitative as well when we do a pilot interview to understand how people view a certain reality. And then we come up with a questionnaire that tries to measure it in quantitative terms. But sometimes also exploratory studies, we can use questionnaires and we can use psychometrics when we just want to measure a bunch of variables and look for associations. But this is not such a good strategy, however. Confirmatory studies are already based on a very specific hypothesis that a researcher wants to test. Or maybe a researcher aims to reproduce some existing findings in a new context or using a new bunch of measures. Sometimes in master's dissertations, our committees say that you need to conduct a completely novel research, but actually replication is an extremely important activity in science. Without replication, we would not be aware about the true effect sizes and the true existence of some phenomena. That's why I think replication is an extremely valid topic for a master's dissertation as well, as long as there is a little bit of novelty to it, for example, with respect to culture in which you replicate this finding or some measures or something else. And sometimes a study can be critical when we plan it in such a way to decide between two competing theories or between two competing statements. So basically, based on the outcome of the study, we make a choice between different explanations of the phenomenon we're interested in. And this is where we approach our next question. Our next question is related to scientific theory. Do we really